Russia has officially pulled out of an agreement which allowed Ukraine to export grain via the Black Sea route. It follows a drone strike on a bridge connecting Russia to the Crimea region, with the Kremlin claiming there's no link to the decision from that incident reported early this morning. Now, this has all sparked fears, at least the cancellation of the agreement, that it could push up prices of wheat products. For more on this, let's speak to Economist Dawie Roodt. Dawie, a very good evening to you. Grateful to have your time. So how difficult a position does this leave the countries that are dependent on Ukrainian grain exports?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. So far, good evening to you. So far, the grain prices went up by, not that by much, by about 3% internationally. So that's not a significant increase, but maybe just a comment. The agreement came to an end. It's not, Russia did not withdraw from the agreement. It came to an end today. So that's the end of the agreement. And of course, many countries are trying to see if they can salvage this agreement and see if they can continue with this agreement. But potentially it can over time have a significant impact on food importers, especially many countries in Africa. Many countries in Africa are very dependent on food that they import from Ukraine, in fact. But so far, the reaction on the markets has not been that significant. Grain prices went up by about 3%, 3.5% or so today, after it became clear that this agreement will not be extended. And we will really have to wait and see what's going to happen going forward. Maybe one or two points that I think are important. One is that the reserves in grain in the United States and in Europe, it's quite significant. So there's a lot of reserves in those two, blocks of countries. And I think perhaps that is part of the reason for this. Another reason why the price didn't go up that much is because I think the financial markets think that this can potentially, this agreement will be extended eventually, and that the grain will start being exported again. So yeah, I think it's a little bit early to say, but in a really bad case scenario, it's quite possible for grain prices to go up easily by 20% or even more.
Right.
And that will have a knock-on effect to other food prices, like, for example, poultry prices, chicken prices, and beef prices and the like.
And you rightly say that this agreement has come to an end. It was a short-term agreement, and in fact, when this extension was basically agreed to by the parties brokered by the United Nations and Turkey, even then the Russians took quite a bit of convincing to finally, at the last minute, get them to agree. There are various geopolitical issues involved, but also Russia is concerned, as I understand it, for example, about what's going on with its ability to get its products around the world, and that came up, in fact, in a conversation between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa. Is there a role for South Africa to play in all of this?
Well, I think South Africa is trying to play a role here. I don't think we are that important to the Russians. I think they are. Russia is economically not important to South Africa. The West is far more important. I think we are trying to box well above our weight category. And I don't really believe that we're going to make much of a difference. South Africa is a very small country, and the whole of Africa is actually a very small country. But I guess we can at least speak to them and see if we can make a difference. But I'm in doubt whether we're going to make a difference.
But economically, what could this do? I wonder if countries near and far on the continent suffer as a result of this arrangement. What bearing would that have for us and the broader African continent?
Everybody will be affected. Remember, grain, like I've said, grain forms the basis of food, because grain goes into a lot of other foodstuffs. It's not only grain in the form of bread that we eat, it's also a grain in the form of chicken that we eat, for example. And grain is internationally traded. South Africa is part of the international community, and if international grain prices go up, as an example, then our local grain prices will go up as well. We have seen recently that the food prices have been increasing in South Africa at an alarming rate. Currently, food prices are going up by about 12% or so. But recently, the rate of increase has been slowing down. Some good news for us in South Africa is that the rand appreciated quite nicely recently. So at the moment now, with roughly a 3% increase in international grain prices the last day or two, I don't foresee any significant impact on food prices in South Africa. But like what I've said, if this is really disruptive, and if it goes on for a long time, then potentially grain prices can go up by much more, and that will have a devastating impact on food prices, including in South Africa. Potentially food prices can go up by 10 or 15% in South Africa. on top of the already 12% that we're currently seeing, and that will have a massive impact on other countries in Africa, especially in countries in the Horn of Africa, like, for example, Somalia imports a lot of grain from Ukraine, and some other places like Morocco also imports a lot of grain from Ukraine. So potentially this can have a huge impact. But like I've said, I think politics is going to determine whether grain will start flowing again from Ukraine, and that's really pretty much an open question. We don't know what's going to happen there.
And I suppose the other concern is that if there is an increase in grain prices, however significant it may be, what many of these countries that are already poor on the African continent would want to do is ensure that it's very much a short-lived scenario, because the longer it continues, the higher the possibility that rising costs of food will bring down the broader economic setup, right?
In fact, many African countries are experiencing significant food shortages at the moment. I know, for example, in Nigeria today, there were some protests about shortages of food price increases, and like many other countries as well. So many, especially in the northern part of Africa, many countries are experiencing shortages of food. So not only poverty, but real hunger is already a major issue in many countries in Africa, the poorer countries in Africa. For South Africa, we are pretty much food, we produce enough food to feed our population in South Africa, but like I've said, we are also at the mercy of international grain prices, as an example. It will also impact on South African food prices as well.
And how do economies such as ours, how do the governments of these respective African countries cushion themselves against the impact of such geopolitical decisions in the long term, especially because when you consider how unaffordable food is already for most people, they cannot afford any dramatic increases, especially occurring suddenly.
Yeah, I think many economists are going to tell you that you need food security. I don't really believe in that. I don't believe food security is that important. With food security, what is quite often meant is that you produce enough food to feed your population. I think what is more important is simply economic growth. If you have strong economic growth, then you can produce surpluses and you can exchange that for whatever you want. Many countries in the world simply do not produce enough food. A very good example is Singapore. They just don't produce enough food because it's a tiny country, but they're very, very good at other things. So I think the answer to a shortage of food, or the answer to hunger, and the answer to all these sort of problems is simply economic growth. So you have to put measures in place to make sure that your economy grows and that you become wealthy. And once you've become wealthy, you can import food. You can buy it from on the world financial markets. Unfortunately, many African countries are very, very poor, and the kind of policies that have been put in place in many African countries are simply not good enough to get the economies to grow. And I'm afraid to say the policies that we have in South Africa is also not good for economic growth. We don't suffer from a shortage of food. Certainly, we do experience some hunger, but that's because of pockets of poverty in South Africa. It's not as if the country is experiencing a lack of food, but South Africa's economic growth certainly is not good enough, and part of the reason for that has to do with the wrong macroeconomic policies. So in the end, good economic policies will result in better economic growth and wealth, and once you've got wealth, you can buy whatever you want.
Dawie Roodt, Economist, good to speak to you. Thank you for your time tonight.